Good evening. Today we want to wrap up our series on Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Williams family played a major role in making the black business district successful. Bill's parents, that would be William Danforth, his parents, John and Lula, had come to Oklahoma in 1902 when the area was still known as Indian Territory. They were looking to settle. Jobs were plentiful in the oil boom. By 1920, the Williams were among the richest black families in Tulsa. They owned a garage, confectionery store, boarding house. They had the first movie theater house for blacks in the city. They opened a second movie house in the city, and then they also opened two movie houses outside the city in Okmulgee and Muskogee, Oklahoma. Their first theater was called the Williams Dreamland Theater.
Picture this community of black people who could not do anything in the city that they were adjacent to. The only thing they could do in Tulsa was work. Couldn't live there. You couldn't eat there. And there was only one place there that you could use the restroom while you worked. And one thing I want to mention about the Greenwood community is they were so prosperous that the dollar turned around from 36 to 100 times before it left the community. That is hard to fathom. It really is, even today.
All that began to change. The land of promise turned ugly for blacks. On the night of May 31st, 1921, William D. Williams, who was 16 at the time, remembers returning home, going to bed, and waking to the sound of gunshots. His father was firing out their apartment window at a gang of white men who were trying to break into the building and loot it.
Totally destroyed. The only thing that was left in Greenwood was part of a church, and that's it, because at the time when the massacre started, there were around 11,000 people in Greenwood. When luck turned on them, there was nothing left but part of a church. On May 31, 1921, planes, and this was after a confrontation with a young black man who they felt had done something to a white female elevator operator. Now, she never said he did anything. She never said that. But she did let out a scream on the elevator, and that's all they needed. So May 31, 1921, they got started. When I said they, I mean the white folks of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
O.B. Mann stormed into the Dreamland Theater, interrupting the film, announcing, "Turn up these lights, the movie is over, 'cause I got news. The white folks are getting ready to hang a Negro boy downtown. We're going down to stop it, and if you want to come join us, come on." Henry Soders, the theater manager and loyal employee of Lula's, evacuated and closed the theater as A.J. Smitherman, O.B. Mann, John Williams, and others armed themselves and drove to the courthouse to confront the sheriff and demand Rowland's release. The first time they arrived at the courthouse, the group left peacefully after a talk between O.W. Gurley and Willard M. McCullough. The second time, a larger group of Greenwood men arrived at the courthouse at about 10 p.m., and a fight broke out when one of the men from the white mob, by this time the mob numbered 2,000, tried to grab O.B. Mann's gun. The gun went off accidentally, but that was all that was needed to spark an all-out war. Hundreds of shots were fired within seconds. During the next 24 hours, Tulsa experienced one of the nation's worst race, they call it riot, massacres in history. At an estimated 270 to 300 people, including some of the city's most prominent blacks, were killed. More than 1,000 homes owned by black families were destroyed, and the black business district was devastated. Overwhelmingly outnumbered, the group of black men fled back to Greenwood. However, the fighting war was far from over. The white mob chased the men, and a fierce gun battle began at the intersection of 2nd and Cincinnati. Many Greenwood residents tried to hold off whites at the tracks, which was the unofficial border between white and black Tulsa, while other residents bunkered down, much like they had done while fighting in the war. As the night went on, the fight went deeper into Greenwood. By midnight, John B. Williams arrived back at his building at Greenwood and Archer. From his second-story window, he had a vantage point from which to defend his home and his neighborhood. While he fired his shotgun and pistol from his bathroom window, young William helped stockpile ammunition and reload the guns. Most of the resulting destruction was done by white police officers, deputies, mobs, and local National Guard units. By midnight, the white attackers had begun setting fire to homes and businesses. It was at this point that John told his wife, Lula, to leave and go to her mother's house. The fighting went on into the early hours of the morning. The next morning, John and William heard the sound of airplanes overhead. They went downstairs and into the street to see for themselves, planes dropping firebombs onto the buildings in the neighborhood. At the sight of this, they decided they need to flee. So John and William split up, leaving their property unguarded and susceptible to looting and burning.
Planes started dropping turpentine bombs. All the telephone and telegraph lines were cut. White folks were turning against their black workers.
The all-out invasion of Greenwood began at the sound of the 5 a.m. whistle on June 1st, 1921. Several witnesses reported white police officers and recently deputized men killing blacks in cold blood. Oklahoma-based city National Guards began to arrive in Tulsa, but rather than heading to Greenwood, they reported to the police station.
And the Red Cross was convinced to treat this massacre as a natural disaster so that they could get the money. Now, they did help. I have to say that. They did help. But this was not a natural disaster. This was a massacre, and there's a difference. And this was the first time that the Red Cross had ever assisted in a man-made disaster. You would think, wow, these white folks invaded this black community. But why was it that the black community was accused of starting a riot?
William recalled, "They never did catch my dad. He got to Pine Street. One of his business associates was white and took him to his home. However, they did catch me. The National Guard were dispatched to Greenwood around 5 a.m. that morning to arrest black residents of Greenwood and detain them. I fled north along Greenwood Avenue, but was caught on Eastern Street. There were 2 or 3 men. I was running and ran right into a man with a shotgun. He pointed at me and said, 'Put 'em up, nigger.' So I put up my hands, and they searched me and took me down the alley and to Greenwood. The National Guard was rounding up men and boys and marched them along the Frisco tracks, past burning homes and buildings, to the convention hall to be held there. I was marched right past my home, and looking up into the broken upstairs windows, I spotted a white man looting our home, holding in his hand my mother's handbag and her prized fur coat."
And they called it a riot. Well, actually, I'll tell you who called it a riot. It was the insurance companies, because they didn't have to pay for riot. That's what they deemed, that this attack on black people by white people was a riot caused by black people.
In an effort to protect the Greenwood residents, National Guard units disarmed and arrested them.
Unbelievable.
The National Guard would not let any one of the blacks leave the convention hall until a white person could vouch for them. Henry Souders knew this and was able to arrange for me to get out. However, they could not find William's mother. On the morning of June 2nd, the damage was done. The fighting and looting had stopped, and on the radio, William heard that it was safe. Having seen with his own eyes his parents' buildings reduced to rubble, he knew he needed to find work somehow. He spotted a help wanted sign in the cafeteria near 3rd and Main. William asked if he could work a shift washing dishes. After his shift, he was paid $1.50. As he walked out of the cafeteria, miraculously, he walked right into his mother. When William described this encounter, he said it was just full of fun and full of hugs and full of kisses when I saw my mother. After this, the Williams family stayed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they were able to partially put their lives back together. They had a home outside of Tulsa, and they were able to stay in that home for a while. Fortunately, Lula was enterprising, and she had the 2 theaters outside of Tulsa, so she still had income. And they were able to put their property back together, but never to the status that they had before the massacre. Lula died of some unknown cause in 1927. Her son, William, went on to be the principal of the Ralph Bunche School, the principal for 40 years of the Ralph Bunche School, the school where he graduated from. And he ended up marrying a lady that became the first black ophthalmologist in Oklahoma. So he did pretty well. William's dad, John Williams, lived for an additional 40 years before he also passed away.
A.J. Smitherman, he passed away. But first of all, he had to leave Greenwood, and he lived in several places before he finally ended up in Buffalo, New York. And he passed away on June 20th, 1961, of heart failure. He died at his writing desk, working on his autobiography. And he had started the autobiography and called it, he had a series of articles in the Empire Star, which was his newspaper. And he had started releasing his autobiography a little at a time. So for 40 years, he was in exile from Tulsa, where he and his brother were accused of starting the 1921 massacre. His name wasn't cleared until 35 years after his death. And that was because of a letter writing campaign by Barbara Nevergold. And that campaign lasted for over a year. At that time, the Tulsa County District Attorney filed a motion to dismiss the charges against Smitherman and 54 other black men charged with inciting a riot in connection to the 1921 massacre. Even the lead attorney for the state of Oklahoma gave immunity to any whites who looted homes or murdered African Americans. The city of Tulsa said that there were 36 blacks killed. There were over 300. They threw them in mass graves. Most of them were never found. They're still saying 36 were killed. And that no payment was made to any black families because they were the ones that started the so-called riot. It's just amazing. It was riot. It was killing for 2 days. And eventually, South African Americans rebuilt their little town with their own resources and with some help from others throughout the nation. If we jump to the summer of 1922, more than 80 businesses were up and running. But then here comes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is one of the reasons for the decline of Greenwood, because then African Americans couldn't wait to go into Tulsa and other cities and sit down next to white people and eat lunch and go to the bars and dance with each other, what have you. Then after that came urban renewal and the freeway construction, which just went straight, just gutted Greenwood. So there, there goes the community. And then in 1965, Edwin Goodwin Jr., who owned the Oklahoma Eagle newspaper, bought some land. He bought enough land to build what's now known as the Greenwood Cultural Center. In May of this year, they're planning a 100th anniversary celebration if the pandemic allows. So let me just throw out a few names of some Greenwood pioneers that you might want to study, and you might want to make sure that your children know at least recognize the names associated with Oklahoma. Okay, O.W. Gurley was the founder. A.J. Smitherman was a publisher of the black newspaper there. So was Edwin Goodwin Jr. As a matter of fact, Edwin Goodwin Sr. was also a newspaper publisher. You had builders, William and J.C. Latimer. They taught boys the building trades. Simon Berry, he started out as a taxi driver and ended up owning a fleet of cabs. He also founded Berry's Park, which is still in existence today. It changed his name to LASIK Park. James Northington was an aviator, owned his own plane, and started an airline charter service. E.W. Woods was principal of the Booker T. Washington High School. Alfonso Williams was a mathematician, developed the first lottery in the state. He also owned a taxi company, a grocery store, a professional baseball team, a restaurant, a nightclub, and real estate. And also Mabel Little, she owned a beauty salon. That's just a few of the people who helped to make Greenwood a prosperous black community. We have touched on how a community pooled their assets and protected each other and upheld each other's organizations, and then ended up just being totally destroyed